Waiting for our live stream audience to make sure we're... Okay. Welcome to another session of Science-Based Choices for Climate Action, which we are hosting here at Dickinson College. Welcome to those of you who are in the room with us here on campus. Welcome also to those who are watching the live stream. It's been a great symposium so far. I'm looking forward to this panel that we're about to hear from. I'll just say real quickly, we're going to be taking questions at some point during this session. You can raise your hand in the audience here, wait for a microphone to come to you for those questions. We'll give priority to questions from students first. We'll also take questions from those who are watching the live stream. You can type your questions for the live stream audience into the chat. You can do that at any point. You don't have to wait for the time at which they call for questions. So we'll have somebody watching those and pulling those out for our panel later. So I'll turn this over to Professor Emily Pawley. I'm really excited for this panel about teaching climate change in the liberal arts. So Emily, over to you.
All right, can everybody hear me? Fabulous. Great. Okay, so I'm Emily Pawley. I teach environmental history and food studies at Dickinson, and I'll be moderating this panel. We're going to be building on the conversation in the last panel on the climate crisis and higher education, and now we're going to be talking about teaching specifically. So this is near the end of the conference, but it is not an afterthought. And I'm thinking of a comment that was made to me yesterday over lunch by our distinguished keynote speaker, Deborah Roberts. So Dr. Roberts was giving a talk at Harvard, and the Harvard scholars there asked if the IPCC was going to be developing a teaching wing to better communicate the complex findings of the IPCC. And it came up in our conversation that the IPCC already has to manage this unbelievably complex process of assessment and consensus building and communication that keeps the climate negotiation process moving forward, as well as maintaining a position of neutrality that keeps bringing people to the table. So maybe it's actually wrong to ask the IPCC to do the entire climate fight, right? To do the science and the teaching and the activism. The climate crisis needs a lot of people doing a lot of jobs. And the job of teaching about the climate crisis is actually literally our job. So in the liberal arts context, this is a job that we are unusually well positioned to do because we have as our basic assumption the idea that social problems are complex and multifaceted, and they have to be approached from multiple disciplines. And at Dickinson, we've really embraced this, and I think we've heard about this in other panels. We have a sustainability graduation requirement, so no one can graduate from Dickinson without taking a class that engages in questions of sustainability significantly. But also, we have sustainability across the curriculum. And that means we have environmental faculty in our environmental studies and environmental science department, but also across the disciplines. So I'm in the history department. We have Professor Tony Underwood, who teaches in the economics department. We have Professor Jorden Hayes, who teaches in earth sciences. And of course, we have Professor Kristin Strock, who is the chair of our Department of Environmental Studies and Environmental Science. There are actually a lot more of us, and I'm looking out in the audience, and I can see many other people who could be on this panel as well. We have people in English, we have people in anthropology, we have people in the languages, in the creative arts. We have a food studies certificate program and a program in social innovation and entrepreneurship. And some of these professors were hired for their specialization in environmental problems. I was, for example. But many of us have been recruited and educated by programs for our Center for Sustainability Education, which is led by Neil Leary, who is also the chair of this conference. Before we start, I do want to remind people, we do have questions coming in from people online, so please feel free to type them in at any time. I see some of my students in the audience. This is a great time to ask us questions, so be thinking about what kinds of questions you want to ask. But I thought that we could all start thinking about this kind of interdisciplinary framework by talking about the classes that we teach that address the climate crisis, and some of the things that we hope that students can get out of those classes. And maybe, perhaps, Jorden, could we start with you?
Sure thing. Yeah, what a great panel and great group of people to sit next to up here. I'm Dr. Jorden Hayes. I'm a geophysicist and a critical zone scientist, which is really just a fancy way of saying that I'm really motivated to understand how things like bedrock at depth influence life at the surface, and how rock conditions influence the susceptibility of trees to drought. And I accomplish this and answer these questions by making fuzzy, colorful images of the ground beneath our feet. As such, because that's my interest and passion, every course that I teach touches on climate change in one way or another. I teach classes in earth hazards. I'm seeing some of my earth hazard students out there in the audience and hopefully online as well. Oceanography, environmental geophysics. I will teach a new course next spring called Treetop to Bedrock, Introduction to the Critical Zone. So in my courses, in addition to understanding fundamental science, there's a few general ideas that I hope to impart that I think will help equip students to be a part of the climate solution. The first idea is that Earth is a system of complex interdependencies that span spatial and temporal scales. It's a skill to be able to zoom in and out of these scales and contextualize components of these systems. And we've seen these recurring themes of systems and scales throughout this symposium. The second idea was illustrated on Monday in Kristin's session by Dr. Ruane, where he showed some maps of impacts from changing climate on various regions. And on those maps, there were places where there's still not enough information. There's limited data. And if I can add an interpretation there, a lack of resources, persons and otherwise, to gather that data. There are still areas with really big questions that need to be answered. Dr. Ruane said we need to know how climate impacts are changing in intensity, frequency, duration, and timing, and how these things vary locally and regionally. So the second idea is that our work as scientists is far from over. The third idea is that it's not a weakness, but a strength that science is always changing, updating, and growing. But to appreciate the strengths of science, we must grapple with scientific uncertainty, confidence, and consensus. Dr. Linda Mearns, in the same session, very nicely outlined our increasing confidence in climate science over the last 3 decades, to the point where we are today in recognizing the indisputable fact that humans are responsible. But later in that same session, in talking about transferring models to action, she highlighted that we will never get rid of scientific uncertainty entirely. And thus, we need to know how to make decisions under uncertainty. It is therefore important that our students start thinking about uncertainty very early on in the educational process. And finally, my fourth idea is that scientific curiosity and our questions are born from a perspective. And thus, we must actively seek diverse perspectives in science. Those are my 4 ideas.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could hear next from Tony.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Tony Underwood. I'm an associate professor and the current chair of the economics department. Equally thrilled to be on the panel with all of you. So I'm approaching this from a social science perspective. I talk about the climate crisis and climate policy in primarily 2 courses I teach: environmental economics, of which there are many of you here today. Hello, all of you. And in a senior seminar in the economics department that I teach called Economic Demography and Sustainable Development. I'll talk first about the former. In environmental economics, I think the place we typically start is to reframe the position of the economy and society with respect to the environment. I think a lot of us, when we first come to our first economics class, which everyone has taken prior to coming to my environmental economics class, we say, here's this circular economy. It exists entirely separate from the environment, and then we have these factors of production that we use to produce stuff and people buy it. And those factors of production are just owned by people. And one of those things that's kind of buried in that text is that land is one of those factors of production, and we use it to produce stuff that people buy, and this generates the circular economy, the circular flow of the economy. And so the first thing is just to reorient that and say, well, actually, really the way it is that the economy resides within the biosphere and has to have a dependent and codependent relationship with it. And so first is that reframing. Then we talk importantly about the theory of externalities and public goods to understand both why we have too much carbon emissions and too much pollution, but also why people generally have little incentive to want to act on climate, given the public good nature of the benefits that action might provide. We then focus a bit on when cost-benefit analysis may or may not be appropriate in the context of environmental policy and climate policy in particular, and the role that discounting future benefits and costs might play in that, and is that really appropriate when we're talking about the time horizons that we have to deal with when talking about climate change. And then finally, and I think importantly, which brings me back to the first point on reorienting the economy as within the biosphere, not separate from it, is to have the tools needed to understand the trade-offs that environmental policy often implies without falling into this trap of a false dichotomy where we can either have environmental protection and climate action or economic development and growth, right? That these things don't have to be at odds with one another, and I think often they're framed as such that is really detrimental to this conversation on climate action. And then finally, we talk in terms of that policy discussion as to taking those conversations beyond notions of efficiency, bringing in elements of ecological economics, and that we have to understand also that we have some biophysical limits and other concerns around equity that need to be considered in the design of policy, other than just what gets us there at least cost. I'll leave it there. That was a lot.
All right, so next, I'm actually both moderator and I think the only person in this conference who is both moderator and participant. So I will be calling on myself to represent the history department. I am a historian, and I'm actually the chair of the history department. I'm realizing we have a lot of chairs in this session. I was hired as an environmental historian, and I try to have the climate crisis be part of all of my classes, even those classes that are not ostensibly about climate. At the moment, I am teaching global environmental history, which is the most humongous class you can possibly teach, right? It's like everything that has ever happened to humans and non-humans for all of time, starting with human migration across the globe and ending with the Great Acceleration, which is the post-1950 huge expansion of population, markets, industrialization, all of the graphs that go like this, right? And then I thought I was narrowing things down by having a new class on the history of climate change. And it turned out, that's also a class about the history of everything. And so one of the great challenges is deciding which parts of everything am I going to talk about. In all of my classes, I think one of my big goals is to convince people that a problem that we think of mostly as existing in the future has a lot of pasts, and that those pasts can help us get some kind of purchase on the different kinds of issues that we're facing, right, in a more concrete way. So, for example, one of the big questions of my global environmental history class is, how is it, in this conference we've heard a lot about the global south and the global north, and the global north has a lot more resources, and the global south has a lot fewer resources. So historically, actually, how did that happen is an important question. And how did resources move from the global south to the global north? Right? And can we imagine that not just as resources need to flow from the global north to the global south, but how did the global north in a lot of ways produce the lack of resources in the global south? Right? That's an important question we ask in history. In my history of climate crisis class, a question that we're asking right now is we're kind of denaturalizing the idea of resistance to climate science. So we sometimes think of resistance to climate science as just people being unwilling to hear the truth. But at the moment, my students have just finished a paper where they read the documents of climate denial that are mostly put into archives after they have been taken from fossil fuel companies during lawsuits, to show the ways in which ignorance about climate or climate denial has been actively produced by a range of institutional actors. And if we understand it as having been actually produced, then we fight it in different ways, right? Because we don't imagine it as being just, we have chosen the wrong words, and they're waiting for us to choose the right words, and then eventually they'll believe us, yes? And one other, I think, way that history, I think, really matters in this is that it can show us that things that we think of as unchanging are actually changeable. And things that we think of as, this is an unchangeable feature of the global society or a US society. Often we talk about the US love of cars. Yes, this is a car-loving nation. Well, in the 1920s, the US was an amazing streetcar-loving nation. So how did the car-loving nation come to be? And who exactly developed the love of cars, and how was that produced? People in the US eat a lot of meat. People in the US didn't used to eat a lot of meat. People in the US used to eat a lot of things that now you would be horrified by, and I invite you to contemplate the entire 1950s if you wish people to think about whether human diet choices can change. So I think history can also show us that kind of flexibility. Finally, I want to turn to Professor Strock, who has to span everything with history of environmental science and environmental studies.
That's
not with history.
Word.
I just stuck history in there because I do that all the time. I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
I'll take it. History. Yeah. We spoke as a group about environmental studies batting cleanup here because it's one of the interdisciplinary departments on campus. So we talked about spanning disciplines and how sustainability is investigated in the Dickinson curriculum across a majority of departments, I'm going to say, and programs. And so within our department, we have natural scientists, we have social scientists, and we engage with the humanities as well. And so we hang our hats on interdisciplinarity within the department level as well as at the college level. In thinking about what I was going to say to introduce, but honestly, the panel just before us, I think, gave us a lot of things to think about and talk about. The idea of being charged with, number one, education. And the figure that was shown in the last panel, if that is your only job as students, is to learn about the climate crisis. That's one thing that you're doing and moving forward on. So as faculty, that's one of our jobs, educate. And that there's ways we can do that. We can do it in an interdisciplinary way. So for example, in our department, the classes that are taught on environmental policy, they don't just discuss policy. They make a place to discuss science and how science can engage with policy. I'm a natural scientist, by the way. I study water. I'm curious how climate change and global environmental change influences our water resources. In that class, I can talk about hydrology and I can talk about algae. I would love to talk about algae for most of the time. But I also need to engage with the fact that the very definition of navigable waters has changed in recent administrations. And so we can't not discuss that if we want to understand how to manage and to study water. And so making sure that we educate in a way that spans disciplines and engages across the skills that we get from the historical context, from the geologic, from the rocks to the trees, and then the economies. What are our solutions and how do we engage these things together? By doing that, in the same place, studying these topics, but doing it from all these areas, but doing it as well, making sure that students don't draw the lines, that they're crossing them. And then that's a way in which we can educate around the climate crisis. Another job marker for us is research and engaging students in that research. And that is some of the most fulfilling experiences that I have as a faculty member here at Dickinson. And the comment from the last session where you need someone to be the catalyst and someone to be the champion. In the research realm is where I've seen that happen beautifully. The student is the catalyst. They ask the most intriguing and exciting and novel questions. You have the most exciting questions. You're new, you have new eyes, you have new insights, and let us be your champions. Let us get you the resources that you need, give you the opportunities, teach you the skills that you need to ask those questions. Often I'm taking students into the Arctic to ask climate change questions where we see a rapid amount of change, where we see resources being utilized in new and different ways. And being there with those students and being their champion is just a beautiful moment for faculty. But I'm going to add something else from Dr. Deborah Roberts' talk, which is practicing, being practitioners. We also, I'm going to keep giving hooks to hang our hats on, the idea of community engaged. That not only are you learning about these things in the classroom, but you're putting them into practice in the community. And so making sure in our classes, when we're studying water and we're studying policy, we're engaging with folks who have very real questions and very real problems in our local community, so that students are actually experiencing and seeing change and seeing the work they're doing as a student matter and be employed in a current problem-solving narrative and in a way where they can see the change happen. So as drinking water utilities are struggling with the new emergence of algal toxins, I'm going to see how many times I can bring up algae today. And they're struggling with algal toxins. DEP has given my students access to all the data that they have in the state as they've just started monitoring this. What can we tell them? What ways forward can we find in collaboration with communities and identifying those needs and letting that drive the learning and the research and the teaching? So in thinking about how climate change and the climate crisis comes up in my experience here at Dickinson, this is what I think of. And our faculty in our department, especially Professor Beavers, we talk a lot about creating turbulent problem solvers. And I like that concept of turbulence because we're in a situation that will not be smooth. And if you're just a problem solver, that's great. We're solving problems. We're not doom and gloom, but be ready for that turbulence. That students are able to remain nimble, that they're able to be resilient when the first option does not work and it fails. This idea that when the path, I think in environmental studies, our students like to think of taking the road that's less traveled, but now that road is not only less traveled, but it's bumpy and it is potholes, central PA, you know what I'm talking about. It looks insurmountable. And to not look at that and feel despair, but to look at that and think, I've been engaged to solve these problems in this kind of world.
So that was a very beautiful transition into the next question.
Mm-hmm, I think so too.
Thank you very much. Because one of the questions that has come up continually, I think, throughout the conference and comes out continually in the course of our lives is the question of how do you deal with despair and students' sense of despair and powerlessness? Because looking at this problem, it's not easy to look at it head on. And it's not easy to kind of trace its different connections without feeling like maybe you would like to get a pizza and watch a show that's not about climate change and sleep, right? That it's just very hard not to look away. So how do we fight despair and powerlessness in our students and maybe also in ourselves by doing that? And Kristin, I know you've been leading conversations on this across the college. I don't know if you want to lead off on this as well.
Certainly, yeah. I'll invite everyone to jump in there as well. So we had a recent conversation a couple weeks ago. If you haven't had enough to do, Neil, you've also been organizing a Let's Talk Climate series this semester where folks can lead a topic and then chat about it. And the one that I led most recently was about climate anxiety. And it was meant to open that conversation give a sense of community where we were able to tackle this outside of the classroom. Students, faculty, staff all came together. And in that, I think as an educator, it's important to know who's sitting in the classroom, who's sitting in this room, who's listening online, and recognizing now that y'all are the climate generation. I'm going to pull from Sarah Jaquette Ray and her wonderful book, A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. But this generation cares deeply about climate change. What's also wonderful is that they care deeply about social justice. And you're the generation that sees the connection between the two. And I can imagine it'd be frustrating when those two things are pulled apart in the world. You're raised with smartphones, social media. You have access to global networks and information. Although you're more connected, it's been shown that this generation can feel more lonely. This generation is the most ethnically diverse generation in human history. You would tell me if that's correct. You've studied history. And, but you're also the most stressed, and you're the most least likely to vote. And so thinking that that's the group that makes up our classes today, I'm going to speak to this and engaging with folks on this as a scientist. So I'm a natural scientist. I'm an ecologist. Scientists historically are trained to remove emotion from that field, that it's meant to be unbiased, and that detaching emotion is potentially a positive there, that you're able to come at something free from bias. But the social science research is telling us that when climate scientists are open to their emotional investment and discuss that, especially around the topic of climate change, it is more engaging and inspiring to the audiences in which they're speaking to. This idea of climate wisdom coming out, that if you actually pull from your emotional self, it makes your rational self even that much stronger. So this idea of moving beyond my best rational scientific self is without emotion. Now that you can't have this feeling of high climate anxiety in the classroom with our students and try to ignore that emotional side. And the science would even say now that pulling on it makes it stronger. And so thinking about moving away from doom and gloom, being more solutions oriented, giving us an opportunity for hope when we would tend to despair. All these things, I think we can do that in a wonderful way in our classrooms. And I'll just end by saying one of the biggest ways to fight this feeling of despair is to identify community there. And I have some wonderful colleagues, Kirk Anderson in educational studies, Amy McKiernan, who studies ethics. They gave me the term connect before content. So as an instructor, perhaps the best thing I can give you is a sense of community beyond the content, and focusing on the content might not be the best way to go. And to engage you more fully, we can connect as a community first.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Jorden, you're also a natural scientist. I don't know if you want to kind of follow on from this.
Oh yeah, I can absolutely say that it's really uncomfortable for me to deal with emotions. But I think that holding space for grief can be very important, because grief can be a sticking point for us. It can be a place where we get stuck, where we retreat to eat a lot of pizza. And so for some, addressing grief is the first step towards action. And so when we're having these conversations, when we're in relationship and in community, I think it's okay to hold space for that grief, because these are very serious issues. But then we can move from there, right? If we're addressing it, if we're dealing with it, if we're coping appropriately, we can move from there to action. I think we can talk about our capacities to care, where our passions lie, and where we can best channel those energies towards individual actions. We can educate ourselves, which aligns, I think, with Dr. Lee's comments and comments of many others throughout this symposium on the importance of education. So yeah, I think that's what I would say about addressing despair.
Addressing despair. Okay, so now I'm going to call on myself again, which I think is ethical, because then I don't get the last word all the time. So I asked this question, and I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I feel like imperfect solutions is a theme. I think one of the things that has really... I gave a lot of students despair early in my career at Dickinson. I was mentioned to other history professors as the most depressing history professor. And that's hard because history is often quite depressing. And I realized that I was contributing to something that has actually shaped my research and my teaching, which is this sense that problems have a past and solutions only have a future. And sometimes I call it false futurity of solutions. And I think that we hear that in some very common cliches that students are told, not in their classes, I think at Dickinson, but just well-meaning older people will say to younger people, they'll say something like, nod if you've heard this, our generation has really messed the world up, and it's up to your generation to fix the problem. Have we heard this? It's familiar. That's actually kind of a mean thing to say to someone. I would just like to say, I have myself said it early on in my career, and I'm like, that's actually kind of terrible. Like, good luck. But it's also a bad characterization of the real past, because it makes it sound like it's the student's job to start to think of solutions for the first time. And we do that also. I used to give assignments where I'd be like, write a lot about a problem, and in the last paragraph, talk about solutions, right? And that, I think, is a quite common assignment form, particularly in high school. And then the students would do something, which I call false futurity, where they would describe a solution that exists, but put it in the future. So they'd be like, people should try bicycles. I'd be like, people have been doing bicycles for 100 years, right? Like, it's not new. So increasingly, I teach the history of solutions, and I'm thinking of doing a whole class on the history of solutions. My history of climate crisis class is going to be half solutions. We're about to pivot, everyone in my class, yes. Where we think about what are the pasts that solutions have. And not all of those pasts are encouraging, like this is not always an encouraging story, but that actually gives us better tools to grapple with the questions we're actually going to be asked in facing the climate crisis. So we have 300 years of tree planting, organized industrial tree planting, actually, to look at and draw upon. Like, who has the expertise of tree planting? What can we learn from those past efforts? If we think of it only as a thing that happens in the future, we lose all of that capacity. Bicycles are the same. Dietary change is the same. I think the only thing that I haven't been able to think of a deep past for is carbon capture and storage. But that one actually has a decades deep past, and when we think of it only in the future, we can't see that. So for me, refocusing to look at solutions as not just as a hope action, but as a way of actually correctly characterizing the past. I think that's been a failure of my whole discipline, and it is my new research project that I am also getting other historians on board with. And that is really coming also to return to the point that students are the catalysts, right? Students asked me these questions, and I was like, oh, we should write about that. So I'm getting students to do it, and other people too. And then, Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, like you said, I don't have a perfect answer either in thinking through this. But the way I'm thinking about how I tend to handle these moments in my environmental economics class where I think, as you suggested, this is the climate generation. Students, for the most part, know the science. They trust the science and, need to know that action is possible. But also that the types of action options we have don't have to be these new things we've never heard of before. And I think what's also true of many of you students in the room, in particular, for those of you that have grown up in the US, have grown up in a political environment in which environmental policy is just this very much kind of dichotomous, two-sided thing, one for, one against, and that's all you've ever known. And I think it's important, and this is tricky, to kind of balance the naivete of thinking things can go back this way again, but also the hope that environmental policy does not have to be this way. So I often talk through, in the context when we're learning about permit trading and cap and trade, of what was a wildly successful and actually bipartisan success story that was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 in the US that developed the sulfur dioxide emissions trading program to really address the issue of acid rain. And from both an economic perspective and an environmental perspective, this was a wildly successful program in terms of its net benefits were large, the improvements in the I'm gonna get the science wrong on this, but in the the sulfate deposition in the soils and the improvements we actually saw over a couple of decades there was wildly successful. And when I say bipartisan, I don't mean what we think of as bipartisan now, maybe 250 to whatever that would be in the 250 votes in the House or 60 votes in the Senate. I mean, the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990 that developed this program got 401 to 21 in the House. It was 89 to 11 in the Senate to develop this program. And so that was only, I know, 32 years ago, that votes like that were possible. And it's not ancient history, and environmental policy doesn't have to be that way. And so that's one of those moments where I feel like, while we can't think that in politics we'll snap back to that tomorrow, I think that's naive, right? But understanding that things weren't always this way is a helpful way of thinking through that solutions, again, a focus on solutions and that they're possible.
Nice history example, Tony. I'm just going to gold star. So I want to make sure we have time for questions, but we did want to just take a moment to reflect on things we might have noticed about the symposium or thought that have come from these conversations that we've been having that have affected our teaching. And so if we could just do a very quick round robin. I'm going to go first and say very quickly that one of the things that has been really clear to me is that there's a huge amount of governance work that needs to be done to respond to the climate crisis. And then all of our conversations about adaptation made clear that there's going to be a lot of conversations at the municipal level, at the local level, at the state level, and that preparing students for those conversations and that form of communication is probably one of my main jobs. That really became more clear to me through this symposium. I don't know if we just want to go down the table in order. Jorden?
Sure. I was really struck by Dr. Bowser's comments yesterday about COP's mandate, or COP's mandate, that Indigenous and local knowledge must be considered in all actions. And that kind of got me thinking about what if science was approached with a similar mandate of consideration? And what if science was taught with that consideration as well?
Thanks very much. Kristin?
Yeah. I think what I was there are so many pieces that I've loved. I loved hearing the message of interdisciplinarity. We're seeing greater integration across the 3 working groups. We're seeing talking about practicing as well as advising and those sort of things. I was really struck by some of the phenomenal questions from our students. And so what I'm taking away from that is when Grace and Whimsy asked about Indigenous nations being involved in this and prioritized by governments at being at the table, and to hear IPCC professionals who are in this field, international folks, saying, that's a great idea. I want to walk away with knowing our students are empowered to get involved, to jump into that discussion. I think of the discussion as a flowing river. Don't sit on the side and watch it past you or study how it's moving past you. Jump in it, and they did. And hearing that was really engaging, and I want to make sure that we continue to think that way and continue to find more ways to engage in this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I keep coming back to, I think this was just yesterday, but Co Barrett, the IPCC vice chair, said something, at the end of this decade, which is a critical decade in terms of the pathways towards net zero globally, at the end of this decade, we'll be talking about the IPCC's 7th assessment report. And what is that going to say? And what role can we all play in what it says? So that's where I'm stuck a little bit in thinking through that. And the end of this decade, we'll be reading that report, and a lot of what we do over the next several years and the actions we take will play a big role in what that report ultimately says.
All right, thank you very much. So now we're going to shift to the question phase. I actually have a really good question that's just come in from the audience, the virtual audience, but be braced we're going to get through the answer, and then it'll be your turn, people in the audience. As you can see in my teaching, I point a lot. Yeah. So Deborah Biskin asks, how are professors cultivating compassion and empathy in their courses as students are not only stressed by climate challenges, but by financial and food insecurity and COVID-19 trauma? And I think that's a really good question. I have the beginnings of an answer if people want to start thinking, because I had a chance to look at it before. So one big advantage, not advantage, but just habit that I brought into this, to the COVID-19, and the 2020 was a very exciting year for teaching climate change, because A, we were doing it online, and B, the students were in places where they were being affected. Like I had students in wildfire zones, and I had students threatened by hurricanes, and then obviously threatened by COVID and threatened by food insecurity. It was helpful that I had been in food studies previously, and I had taught introduction to food studies and had the experience of, we always take the students to the food pantry on campus, Project Share, which is sponsored by the campus. And every time I have gone, a student has explained that they use food pantries. And that has been a big shock for other students in the class who are used to kind of distancing themselves from people who need those kinds of services. And so one thing that I find has been very helpful is A, always keeping in students' minds that the trauma that they are discussing in academic ways may be the literal trauma of the people in the room, and that the students who have that trauma don't have to mention it if they don't want to, but also making sure that in the class we have the voices of people who are traumatized as a form of knowledge, right? So bringing in as sources and bringing in the research, so that we're used to accepting that as knowledge as opposed to seeing that as the creation of a kind of studyable victimhood, right? And so that's been really helpful for me. I probably, I don't know if this is, who would like to tackle this question else in the panel, but.
I think kind of building on that,
Yeah.
I teach a course in earth hazards, and almost everybody's been affected by a hazard at one point or another. So there's a lot of knowledge to draw from in the class, and I think embracing that, and students had incredible perspectives that way, but also not forcing to relive that trauma, I think has been important as well. So opening the door for that to be shared, but also not requiring it, I think has been helpful, and being compassionate and bringing some of these climate hazards to life as well. I mean, real people are facing them, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will just confirm that faculty, as was mentioned in the last session, are in fact human. And I think letting our students see that sometimes makes it easier to have some of these conversations. And that doesn't mean we can't be professionals, but I think that goes a long way.
I think it just reaffirmed my need for community is what, my need and the students' need for community in the classroom and outside of that. And just making sure that we make space and time for that. In 2020, when everything closed down and students were sent home and unclear how, am I still going to graduate? How's this course going to, we were hit with things that we've never handled before. And I had just had a baby. I am human. I had a baby. And so I wasn't teaching. And so instead, I wrote postcards to every single one of our majors, just checking in. How are you? How you doing? And it kicked off some really interesting communication that I had never had with students before. And some are pen pals now. And and it just, but this idea of it just, the idea of connecting, we learned a whole new way to connect in the classroom and outside of the classroom. And making sure that sense of community, and I just realized how important it was and how I might have taken it for granted and how it informs the teaching and the interactions and the way that we can do all that.
I just want to add one more thing, because what you were, Kristin, your comment reminded me that another thing I had to do, and I think a lot of us did, was overhaul my syllabi to make space for people who are having life interruptions, which, everybody was having life interruptions. And kind of traumatic events. And I haven't gotten rid of that since COVID, because those events have not gone away. And so I really appreciate the training that COVID gave me. Yeah.
And I think it's important to put out that there were a group of folks that really worked hard. We started having resources brought forward on trauma-informed teaching.
Yeah.
And those were distributed broadly. And so those resources exist, and I feel badly I didn't know them before. Yeah. And that those resources are there. And now there's another group of folks who are putting forward work on promoting effective dialogue in the classroom. So how do we make sure that there's an equal opportunity to voice opinions, thoughts, ideas, and that it's an actual skill that we can be teaching students how to better hear other voices, how to better put your voice into a flowing river of dialogue and conversation. So the idea of those being skills that we need to make space for, that we could actually be promoting ourselves and teaching as well, I think is very important.
Okay, so the time has come. Being an undergraduate-facing institution, we are going to prioritize undergraduate voices. So if we could, I think, get a microphone to this person here. And if you can... There we
go. Hello. Thank you for speaking with us. I have a question kind of about the role of educating students. So liberal arts students, such as the ones at Dickinson, are often referred to as future leaders, especially for problems such as the climate fight. But there's an implication there that we as students are somehow more prepared than those who did not have access to this education. Can you speak to how this idea displaces people who don't have the privilege of education and those who are most impacted by climate change, such as those who live in areas affected by environmental racism and poverty? Basically, how do we ensure that we educate climate-conscious students without making them feel like they're the most important in the room?
That's a great question.
Good question.
Who wants to go first? I can go first.
Okay, I thought Kristin.
All right. Yeah. I'm a big talker. So I actually, I realize I'm saying this in front of important college people, but I sort of push against the idea of leadership in general. I feel like leadership is not a super helpful model in some ways because it encourages everybody to think that they have to restart every process themselves alone. And so we end up with 1,000 little tiny organizations instead of functioning organizations, which we need to fight climate change. And I think that actually one of the things that we learn in the history of science and in the various disciplines that I'm part of is, and we want to teach people in community engaged education, is actually not to go out to affected populations and say, I am here with my knowledge. I will save you. Here's what you need. But in fact, to go and ask people, what do you need? And how can I bring you what you need? And maybe what they need is research, and they might need you to answer some specific set of questions. Maybe what they need is resources. Maybe what they need is access to the people that you have access to. So thinking more flexibly about those kinds of conversations and really respecting the kind of knowledge that people have in affected communities, I think is really central to a lot of the kinds of pedagogy that I'm interested in moving forward. And we've definitely found that working with Carlisle community. I've had conversations with people on the north side where we have assumed that people on the north side, so this is particularly the historic African American community in Carlisle, that what they really need is a bus. And they don't actually necessarily want a bus. They have worked out a bunch of car systems that are kind of informal, and they have a bunch of other sort of transportation issues that they've solved, and they have actual requests that we've started to see answered, like they want the borough council to start having meetings on the north side so that people feel comfortable going. And the borough council just started having meetings on the north side so that people feel comfortable going. So this kind of coming in with an idea and having that idea turn out to be wrong, I think that's a very valuable part of education and that we're really trying to communicate with a lot of our work. I don't know if, Tony, you found that also with the Carlisle Climate Action Plan? Or...
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I'm on the Carlisle Climate Action Commission. We developed and passed a climate action plan for the borough last year. I was a member of the leader of the Pathways and Analytics team, but we had a community engagement team and some other teams that contributed to pulling this plan together. And I think from day one, our goal was to say, sure, we have some expertise in developing these plans, but how does the community view these potential changes? And that was our starting point. And so one of the first things we did was a survey, right? And which is an imperfect mechanism, right? And we knew that from the very beginning, but it was a sense of trying to understand, how would these types of things be perceived by the community, who they will impact most directly. And so, yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
All I'll say, I think the idea of even teaching that the way, a responsible and effective way to do research is to ask first, who is this for? And to, engage with the community in a way that makes, part of Dickinson is a useful education, right? And so what does that look like? That's a skill to teach students. That's not something that's being taught everywhere to say, a key step in research is question, method. Yeah, and speaking, contextualizing and making sure that it's grounded in a community or a place or a purpose. And just the idea that those skills can be incorporated in teaching in a fully engaged way. I think, I was taught I would come into classes and we were going to have a debate. There was a right and there was a wrong, and I wanted to be the winner. And, and you think, now I'm teaching students to have a dialogue. That's a completely different way to move a student through a topic, and hopefully that means when they leave Dickinson that there's a very different way that they will engage with a group of folks around a problematic issue.
Yeah, what a great question. Thank you. I think if you maybe change the skill from leadership to partnership. And that's something that you can learn here on campus, that you're doing all the time in collaborating with your community. And that's a skill to learn how to be a good community member, to be a partner. And also cultivating that skill of curiosity. So if you can be a curious partner, I think that would be a win on the education front.
Oh, I feel like being a curious partner might be one of my learning outcomes now. All right, I'm sure that there are other great questions out there. I feel like those were two really fantastic questions. And I really want to thank my fellow panelists for a great conversation, and join with me in thanking them. Well done, everyone.
Thank you. I thought that was a fascinating, fabulous panel. Learned a great deal. Thank you all for attending this session. Thank you to the virtual audience. One of the things, there are a number of things I'll take away from this conversation, but at the very beginning, Professor Hayes said that she hopes that her students will be part of climate solutions. I think we might rephrase that now as maybe in response to the question that was asked of our students becoming partners in solutions. And this frames up like the idea of what we do at Dickinson with education for sustainability. It's a stance that's quite different from a lot of education. It is not about imparting knowledge and learning information, science, facts, history. It's about what are you going to do with it? What we're doing here in education for sustainability and education for climate action as being part of that is, what we want to do is empower you to be part of solutions, not lead solutions on your own, but being partners in solution, becoming engaged. So it's not a neutral, it's not an unbiased kind of a system. We're not going to tell you what action we want you to take as being kind of our agents out there for us, but be thinking about what's your role, what are you going to do in order to move societies in directions you think are positive, and how you do that in partnership with others who come from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different kinds of education, whatever it might be. I think this is just an extraordinarily powerful panel that we had here. Applaud you. All right, so our next session starts at 1:30 on social, economic, and technological transformations. I think that's going to be an excellent panel. Please come back and join us for that. but yeah, we got plenty of time. That's not until 4:30.
What did I say?
Your example of the that was given by a clear presentation. Data the bipartisanship came together.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Because it was irrefutable data.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So you'll load that into the
That we will see
folder.
a repeat of that as we find it, data becomes more.
Okay. All right. Hey Giuseppe, I've seen you around quite a bit for this.